Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Governor's Summit on Early Language and Literacy session on Project GLOW, Growing Language Outcomes Within Family Childcare. I'm Wendy Lumley, a literacy consultant working with the Deal Center.
And I am Kim Scott, the Administrative Office Manager with the Deal Center, and we will be assisting our presenters for today's session.
A few housekeeping items to keep in mind before we get started. We encourage you to use the chat box to ask questions, which will be addressed throughout the presentation. We will also drop any links shared during the presentation in the chat box. Participant handouts for this presentation are available in the auditorium below the access link and session description. Please direct all technical questions to the chat box drop-down menu, and we will respond as quickly as possible. Also, this session is being recorded, so please remain muted throughout the presentation. I'm excited to introduce our presenter, Dr. Rhiana Mason. Dr. Mason is a research scientist at the Urban Child Study Center at Georgia State University. Prior to joining the UCSC, Dr. Mason served as an associate professor in psychology at Emmanuel College for several years, where she helped to expand the undergraduate curriculum in psychology. Her research interests include vocabulary development and assessment of learners from diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds. Kim, please stop sharing your screen so the presenters may begin, and welcome Dr. Mason.
Good morning, everyone. It is great to be joining this summit on this year. I can tell everyone I had an amazing time when we were all together in person in Milledgeville, and so I'm glad to be joining as a presenter this year. So as it was already said, today we're going to talk about growing language outcomes in family child care, or Project GLOW. This was a collaborative effort between myself, Dr. Gary Bingham, and Dr. Krista Herring-Beal. I am going to let Dr. Beal introduce herself and tell you a little bit about her background. Dr. Bingham has also joined this session, and I would also like to give him space to introduce himself and his role as well. I'm going to, while they're speaking, I'll go ahead and put the link to our center in the chat so you can find more information about the Urban Child Study Center at Georgia State.
Thanks, Rhiana. My name is Krista Herring-Beal, and I used to work at the Urban Child Study Center with Dr. Mason and Dr. Bingham. And while this study was going on, I was actually an assistant professor at Utah State University, and since that time have taken a position as the Vice President of Research and Evaluation for the Children's Equity Coalition. And I'll let Dr. Bingham introduce himself.
Good morning. Hi, Gary Bingham, Professor of Early Childhood and Elementary Education. Very excited to share some results with you today.
Thank you both. And now I just wanted to kind of set the stage a little bit. I know we're virtual, we're in different spaces, but I want to invite this to be a collective effort as well. We're going to share a lot about the work and the partnership that we shared with family child care providers in Georgia and Utah. But again, this could not have been possible without a joint effort. And so there were many others that help us get to the point where we could feel comfortable going into family child care homes. I wanted to acknowledge the Professional Family Child Care Association of Georgia. They were instrumental, one, at inviting us years back when Dr. Bingham and I were both involved in the quality rating and improvement system evaluation. It was a great time to learn more from family child care providers, things that they were dealing with and sort of priorities for them at the moment. So being able to have a partnership with them to also validate that there was a need to do the study that we'll talk about today was very helpful. I'd also like to thank all of the family child care providers who were involved, both in that quality rated and improvement study evaluation, but then also in a precursor to this work that was funded by the Zeist Foundation, and then everyone who persisted with us and even continued communicating during a pandemic year. And so those are providers both in the state of Georgia and in the state of Utah. We'd also like to thank the centers that joined us as well. Through the Urban Child Study Center, we have research practice partnerships with a number of child care centers in the Atlanta metropolitan area. And so for them extending yet another opportunity for us, we're truly grateful. Then I'd also like to acknowledge the graduate students that helped make this work possible, the students who served as coaches and reinforcers and communicators also. Before we move on into the heart of our discussion, I would just like to reinforce that we do have a chat box. You can put your questions into that chat box as we're going. We won't hold all of the questions until the end. So if there's something that you need clarification on, please go ahead. I can see that chat box. Our other members of our team can see that chat box. And so we'll try to deal with questions as they come. So now let's talk a little bit about why partnering with family child care is important. There's this general understanding that children are spending a lot of time in out-of-home settings during their early childhood development. And this time that they're spending is a major influence in their academic outcomes. There's a lot of variability in what these settings look like. Having care provided within the family child care setting is not the same as what we see in freestanding centers. Family child care is often not illuminated in the literature as far as the positive aspects that are occurring in these environments. And the dynamics of what's happening within these homes is also very different. No day I can say is quite the same. The routines may mimic what's happening in a center, but there's also all of these other adjustments that are unique to a family child care setting. The differing age groups that are being provided for, the integration of what's happening with the family child care provider and maybe her home life as well, the flexibility that she offers the families that have entrusted children in her care, and just the exciting things that children bring to that environment during the day. And so we know that language outcomes, the interactions, we've heard a lot about how language and literacy at the earliest stages are then predictive of academic achievement later on in life. What's set at about 30 months of age is critical even into adolescence, about the 7th grade year. In addition to all of that, we're talking about the importance also of setting skills and temperament and development for our youngest learners who will then be entering our workforce later. So it's critical to get a lens into what's happening within family child care to see these language interactions early. So now I would like to talk a little bit more about the importance of language. This whole partnership, growing language outcomes, is really understanding those dynamic relationships between the provider and the child. I've seen recently now news about how work like ours is also providing an equitable foundation, given everyone who's in the learning environment a chance to be heard. We know that children learn what they hear the most. And again, they're spending a lot of time in these out of home contexts. And so these conversations that are happening are important. Children learn words for things and events that interest them. And so having that back and forth set of conversations between a provider who's interested in hearing what they have to say and also taking into consideration what's happening in their daily experiences is important as well. Interactive, back and forth, exchanges, conversational turns, things that are responsive rather than passive promote learning. Also, children learn words best in meaningful contexts, not just in isolation, not just single words. Given the fact that language is very culturally driven, then situating words, their definitions, how they relate in other contexts is also very critical. Children need to hear diverse examples of words and language structures. So more than just a single word, more than just two-word phrases, words in rich contexts, lots of examples, and a variety of words, not just simple words that they hear all the time, but expanding to more sophisticated language. And then lastly, vocabulary and grammatical development are reciprocal processes. So again, all of this interaction within a rich context is critical for learning at the point of development that we're looking at as a snapshot, and also how that helps later on in life. So our study was dedicated towards 4 central research questions. Now, I want to say this is research driven. The point of funding our initiative, and I want to stop. When I was doing the acknowledgements, I failed to thank the Deal Center, who funded this work as one of the grants. And so I want to acknowledge that now. So funding from the Deal Center allowed us to address these 4 questions. How effective is the combination of Read Write from the Start modules? We'll talk a little bit about what Read Write from the Start is and who's providing those modules. And Lena, a particular tool in improving the quality of teachers' reading and language interactions with children. I'll pause here for a moment before I go into the other 3 research questions, because I think our audience may be familiar with the Cox campus. They're also may be familiar with other efforts that have been happening around the state, like Project Little. So we're not the only ones who have been looking at the integration of this technology tool and its impact within family child care and within centers. As we go throughout the presentation, I'll highlight how what we're doing is a little bit different than what others have been doing as well. We also looked at what types of coaching supports are associated with teachers accessing and completing the online modules provided by the Cox campus. What are the associations between the quantity of words spoken and conversational turns taken by family child care providers and high quality instructional practices? And then lastly, what types of barriers exist to teachers' completion of online resources and the implementation of these research-based strategies? So basically, in a nutshell, we're going to look at what's happening within these family child care environments when they've been exposed to research-based strategies. How is their language changing, if at all? And how is this related to whether or not they're engaging with these modules that we're providing to them along the way? As I said in the beginning, this was a collaborative effort. The original plan was to include just providers in Georgia. We realized that what's happening in Georgia may be unique or it may be similar to what's happening in other states. We enlisted the support of providers in Utah as well. And the additional reason why family child care providers in Utah were critical to this project is that the professional-based learning modules that we chose have now been adopted in a lot of family child care provider homes and in centers, given the importance that it has attracted through our state's quality rated system. So we also included a group that we could say may not have had as much experience with these professional development modules as well. For those who participated, we invited them to be in 3 groups. Our first group, we got to know them a little bit. We gave them some information through a survey. We invited them to record with this Lena tool. We provided coaching, professional development, and then we followed them for a period of time where they were just asked to record their language using this technology tool or Lena, and then observe them afterwards. This group that I'm describing right here was the group that was funded by the Zeiss Foundation. And so we are really appreciative that they stuck with us across time, as you'll see. This second group did most of what the first group I described did as well. The big difference is that they had some prior exposure to professional development through the Cox campus and allowed us to track them over time as well. And I'm seeing that I've kind of flipped groups 2 and 3. This group 2 is actually that group that I mentioned that had prior exposure with us over time. This first group I'll go back to is the new group that we recruited. And then lastly, we had a group where they weren't exposed to the professional development, at least not through our efforts. They recorded with Lena and they continued to do that over time. There wasn't any coaching, there wasn't any feedback, and there wasn't a requirement that they were exposed to these professional development modules. And I'm just going to check the chat box since I know that what I said may have caused a little bit of confusion, but I think we're okay. So 3 groups, one that we started work with in the past, a second group that came on board through the funding we received through the Deal Center, and a last group also new to us, but they weren't required to do as much as either groups 2 or 3. So we had a total of 17 participants. 8 of them were in the state of Georgia. 6 of them were in the state of Utah. 3 of them were teachers. 6 were white and 11 were Black or African American. If we look at how we recruited our sample, again, even with blessings from the PFCCA, our prior history with working with family child care providers, still quite an endeavor to get the length of participation required. So we did attempt to recruit quite a few providers and teachers, and then you can see the response rate right around 8% of who we communicated with. And I can say with everything that happens during the day, I don't see why it would be any easier when there's a lot of competing things that are happening. I mentioned in our state, there were other efforts doing similar things. So a lot of things that providers were juggling with at the time. So very grateful for them to allow us to come into their homes and spend the number of weeks that they spent with us over time. So I mentioned that we gave some surveys. We got some information at baseline just to understand what were the things that were already happening within those homes, and how they were related to what we think about as quality instructional practices. We collected this data prior to COVID, but due to COVID, we were unable to collect the same data to compare whether or not instructional practices had changed after the time we spent with our providers. We used a tool called the Classroom Assessment Scoring System, or the CLAS. It has 2 domains: emotional and behavioral support and engaged support for learning. If we look at this kind of pink or mauve box, you can see within those domains, several things related to emotional and behavioral support include positive climate, negative climate, teacher sensitivity, regard for child perspectives, and behavior guidance. Let me also note that we're using the toddler tool. As I mentioned, there are a variety of ages that are cared for in family child care provider homes. And so we found it appropriate to kind of use the middle of the way. We could have chosen infant, toddler, or preschool. And for the homes that we were in, this toddler tool captured who was there the best. In this second domain, engaged support for learning, there are aspects then that are related to that richness of providing language interactions, like facilitation of learning and development, quality of feedback, and language modeling. If we look at where our providers started, they were about in the mid-range for our emotional and behavioral support, and in the low to mid-range for engaged support for learning. And this does suggest, particularly for this engaged support for learning, there is room for growth with an intervention like we implemented. So we did engage in a multi-tiered intervention, which included professional development, in-person coaching, and this Lena recording and feedback. And I'm pausing to give my mouse a chance to catch up to where I am on the screen. This multi-tiered intervention really allowed us to stack on approaches that have been used in the literature. Like I mentioned, Project Little in the state has also, looked at aspects of this as well. And it also allowed us to look over time to what the Lena Foundation does as well. They capture a program called Lena Grow that lasts for about 10 weeks and utilizes these components as well. So we mentioned that we were using tools from the Cox campus, Read Write from the Start. Our focus was on the talk lessons and the power of language. And we introduced these modules to providers. The plan was to do one session or one module every week. As we know, things happen. So some of our providers may have taken a little bit more time in between. So it may not have turned out to be a one-to-one weekly engagement with the Cox campus. But over time, 83% of the providers who were asked to engage with the Cox campus completed all of the modules that were required. For our coaching, professional learning, we adopted a model from Jim Knight. It included this approach where we're in the home, we made an observation, exposed our providers to the online modules, collected Lena data, and provided feedback. The model that we used is consistent with existing research on best practices in professional learning. And it really emphasized the importance of providers participating in their online coursework, then receiving intensive and targeted mentoring within their setting. Within this coaching model, we emphasized components like identifying, learning, and improving. Typically within a family child care setting, our providers are usually, isolated as an adult. And so being able to have this dialogue and exchange and mentoring from our coaches about what we've seen from the Lena report, giving them a chance for the coach to model, listen, and then support their instruction was important. So again, another snapshot of the coaching visit, providing feedback, identifying an area of focus, connecting to what we know is good research practice, reviewing with our providers, and then closing, giving goals for the next time. So now let's talk a little bit more about Lena. One, I want to say that I believe that there's been a recent article in Forbes that has talked about how Lena is this innovative tool that is going to provide an equitable foundation for language interactions. The Lena technology captures recording through a digital language processor. And what makes our research unique compared to some of the other efforts is that this digital language processor was worn by the provider or the teacher in the classroom and not the child. Typically, you'll see this little, it's a purple device, goes into a vest. We've seen children think they're superheroes because they have this vest on, where in our case, our providers or our teachers were the superheroes wearing this device. The Lena software that is attached to this tool teases apart adult and child speech, as well as background noise like television and music. The software also produces automatic counts of speech and indicators of adult-child language interactions like conversational terms. Because we uniquely use this tool with teachers wearing the device, we were only able to utilize the automated counts of teacher speech and not the adult-child language interactions. In order to capture those interactions for the conversational turns, it took another step of actually capturing the recording, transcribing what was said, and then counting those turns manually. The Lena software was used to provide data and providers could choose when to record. We left them that flexibility. We told them to record during the time that they typically provide care, which some of their schedules varied quite a bit. And as I mentioned, the Lena provides reports to track their words spoken in these conversational turns. Now, in some cases, we were able to provide children with Lena as well. And so the providers could see what was happening. I'm just going to report today on what's happening with the teacher. If we think about how to make the Lena tool cost effective and more widely adopted, this is a situation where there are fewer devices needed. And so on these Lena reports, You're also able to see benchmarks or these stars where you've achieved a developmentally appropriate amount of language during the time that you're being recorded. In the next few slides, I am going to unpack quite a bit of data. So I'm going to orient you to these graphs and remind you who we're working with and how long we've worked with these different groups. So let's just look at the y-axis first. We have the adult word count per minute. And you can see that it's listed here in 20-word intervals. And along the x-axis, we have time. So these are the time points at which we recorded with the Lena device. Take note that we had one baseline observation when we came to observe what was happening. And then we started looking at what was happening once providers were exposed to the Cox Campus modules. And then we have the points in time where they completed those modules and then were left to just record their talk. And now let's look at the colors of these lines. We have both yellow and blue indicating data from our providers in Utah. And then we have variations of red for our Georgia providers. So I'll call attention to both the yellow and the blue at first. And if you can see my mouse kind of hovering over one, if we just look at baseline, quite a few of our providers are starting around the same level. We have one that's already talking a lot, but as you can see, they all kind of, end up in a point at the beginning. They're making different amounts of language, or they're talking in different amounts of language all throughout the time that they're being exposed to the coaching and the professional development. If we follow this one yellow line here, we see that they actually stopped. And so I want to draw our attention away. They actually did not provide any data, even though they were given the opportunity to, as well as this one red provider here. So now we're going to draw our attention to the dashed lines, as those are the providers who not only captured their talk during the learning phase, but they also have some data about how they maintain their talk. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of variety, but you do see some peaks in which they're talking a lot. And if we look back over here, those peaks are above their starting points. Now, that was the group who we followed through the support of the Deal Center. This next set of data is the group that was primed, if you will. We had prior exposure with them. They had the same professional development. So what you see here is back in time with them, same period, but their observations that we have here with Lena recording only, where they were being followed at the same time that we were providing new providers with professional development, you can see a similar trend where they're starting at different points of talk, making changes as they're learning, and then without any feedback, without any support, they're also seeing peaks where they're engaging in lots of talk. Now, if we look at this solid red line, we also see a provider who is here in Georgia, who not only has these peaks of talk, but just takes off over time. And if you haven't figured out by now that one, it takes time, right? So within development, whether or not we're a child or an adult, if we're practicing something, it's becoming part of our routine, part of a habit, it takes time. We looked at the time that it takes during the 10 weeks that we expose providers to coaching and professional development, and then the time when they could return to business as usual. We weren't having interactions with them, and what happened. Well, this third group gives us further support that there's a need for that professional development and mentoring, exposure to high quality instructional practices, feedback, all of the things that we unpacked previously. If you look here now at these three providers, where they started at baseline, and then over time, without any support, all they're doing is recording their talk, not getting feedback about the reports. Sure, there are some dips and valleys in their talk, but they don't approach the level that we've seen in the other two graphs. And if we look at this one yellow line here, they eventually trail off to a degree of talk that's not acceptable for supporting our children over time. So our work was just a snapshot of what can be done and how using this multi-tiered intervention in a small sample can work. But there were some core challenges and barriers. One, within recruitment, as we mentioned, we communicated with a lot of providers and teachers, but there were competing research studies and initiatives. And then also what I said at the beginning, Cox Campus is being pushed as modules that everyone should take part of. So it was also a challenge in finding providers who had not been exposed to the modules and needed to start where our intervention began. Being able to take the time to fit within the schedule of our providers was a challenge. So providers finding time for this extra professional development, and then also getting some feedback from them that some of the modules also need to incorporate examples that are drawn from family child care homes so that they can easily see how to adjust their practices. And then lastly, in-person coaching, scheduling conflicts, it takes a team effort. Then being supported to cover their teaching responsibilities while they were there, and just holding themselves accountable for PD. The Lena recording, we mentioned how we uniquely use the device. There's often overlapping speech. There are a lot of things that need to be taken apart or teased apart so that we can see how our work can be generalizable in other spaces. And just make sure that there's integrity in having a teacher or provider wear the Lena device. So again, we're grateful for being able to have this time to partner with our family child care providers, a snapshot in what a multi-tiered intervention looks like, and then the promise of having talk increased, growing those language outcomes within the family child care setting. We'll now entertain any questions, and I have not been attentive to the chat as I promised early on, but we'll elevate it in my view. I see one question or two questions, I think, that I skipped. One was, where can the class be accessed? I am going to defer to one of my colleagues, Dr. Bingham or Dr. Beal, to actually put the link in for Teachstone.
She already did put the link. It's in there. Yeah.
Oh, great, great, great. Okay, so I'm catching up.
Yeah, I think the very last comment is the one you want to catch up on, which is any suggestions as how we can get Cox Campus to daycare providers and actually get them to utilize that resource.
Thank you, Dr. Bingham. I think one suggestion goes back to what I mentioned about making sure that providers can see the relevance to what's being communicated into those modules, allowing them to see themselves in the environment. So perhaps, extending what Rollins has done a great job of doing, but also included some examples of how this might work in the context of their day. I think we discovered that as we were providing the coaching and mentoring and being able to, in real time, come up with these examples of how to layer the suggestions and strategies into their routines. I think that's one suggestion. Dr. Bingham or Dr. Beal, do you all also have suggestions?
No, I think that's great. Thank you.
I think one of the things we found, Rhiana, was how easy it was to use the strategies throughout the day. I think often when we go in and learn a module, we think, oh, this is going to be complicated. I'm going to have to change my routine throughout the day. And that's not how the modules are presented. And as we modeled with providers, we found that they were already possibly doing some of the pieces, and we were just making them a little more robust, and that it was quite easy. There were multiple times throughout the day they could increase talk.
Thank you. I think that's wonderful comment. So maybe even changing our approach as to why going through this professional development, is needed. I think sometimes we can be adverse to thinking we have to change something that we know we're already doing so well. So it's more than just changing, but it's growing, it's development. We all have to be lifelong learners, and there's nuances and things that we need to discover.
Dr. Mason, do you think there's any way to tie some of this, like with the Cox campus, to the quality rating for daycare centers as maybe part of an initiative? Maybe is that being a part of quality rating to participate in those kinds of things?
So I think some of that is happening already. There are a few of the modules, I think, that are becoming a sequence of sort of the baseline things that you need to familiarize yourself with. So perhaps extending those efforts. And again, yes, maybe when providers are getting that technical assistance, when they're putting their portfolios together, to reinforce some of what Dr. Beal and myself have said might be helpful.
I think about Dr. Mason, and a question I have, and I haven't looked at the data, and I'm sure you have, but like, as we think about the instructional routines that happen in family childcare, and we think about the ups and downs of quality across time of what the women were doing in their family homes to support children, I wonder if some of the descriptive data that we have could be used to be thinking more deeply about, like, when are the most naturalistic interactions happening, and then how might one connect it to a model for technical assistance for programs? Because there's obviously, and I think Project Little shows too, there's obviously certain times of the day when providers just kind of don't talk as much, and I think it's helpful to know what those kind of times of the day are. And to then address or maybe make some supplemental materials around that as well.
I think that's a great suggestion. Certainly, we've spent some time tagging activities and routines and events. And in fact, I will say that the data that we presented was all tied to this, I'll say, loose definition of instruction. And so when I say instruction, it wasn't diapering, it wasn't transitioning from the outside, it wasn't some of the more just kind of organizational things that happened throughout the day. There were times where either the provider was in her morning routine, or if they were outside, it was a time where they were capturing, here's what a bug looks like, and really extending language with the intent to teach a concept. And so I definitely think we can go back and unpack some of that within the rich sources of data we have.
I think that's all the questions that we have. Thank you, Dr. Mason, for a wonderful presentation, and thank all of you for joining the session. We hope you found the information beneficial, and please enjoy the rest of the summit.